I'll stay in the F-16 as long as I possibly can.
The Air Force in the 1970s, the early 1970s, announces that for the first time ever, they're going to allow women to fly military aircraft.
And boy, that got our back up, because we knew darn well we had flown their planes away in '44.
We know about flying's happinesses and small quiet terrors, and the uniqueness of the event really grabs the dreams of all of us. There were 25 American women during World War II who went over and flew in England. Women were recruited by Jackie Cochran in 1942 and went over to England that spring and summer. They flew for the British Air Transport Auxiliary, which was a part of the RAF, but as one of the men from the RAF said, oh yes, the Air Transport Auxiliary, it's nothing but a bunch of idiots, cripples, and women. But they ferried airplanes all over, and so the women who were in England did get shot at and did have experiences in London being bombed.
By September of 1942, the Army Air Force was in trouble. They needed pilots desperately. We were fighting on 2 theaters, in the Pacific and in Europe, and they still had to get all those planes that were being built in the factories, from the factories to the points of debarkation on both coasts. Nancy Love didn't want to train a lot of women to fly, so that's what she did. She got 25 women, eventually 28 women, and these were highly experienced women. The first 13 averaged something like 1,200 flight hours, and they started working for the Ferrying Division. Jacqueline Cochran had gone to England, had taken some American women to England to fly for the Air Transport Auxiliary.
She came back in September of 1942 to headlines saying that Nancy Love had been given the go-ahead to start the WASP, and she was furious.
Jacqueline Cochran wanted to lead a large group of women. Went to Hap Arnold, General Hap Arnold, and said, we talked about this, I want my training program. And so they decided to start a training program, take less experienced women pilots and train them to fly military style. They end up merging in August of '43 and become the Women Air Force Service pilots.
I got a telegram saying my services was needed, and if it interested, report to Chicago for an interview. I already had a pilot's license.
So I had my interview scheduled ahead of time with Jacqueline Cochran 2 days after I turned 18 and a half.
Jackie Cochran always said 25,000 women applied. I always thought she was making it up, but I've seen the letters. 25,000 women applied, 1,830 were accepted to the training program, and then 1,074 graduated.
That was where we really learned to fly the Army way.
Jackie Cochran wanted to have women who were feminine looking, who were athletic, who fit her ideal. She also wanted white women.
There was one girl that did apply, but Jacqueline Cochran said that because the Army wasn't integrated at the time, that she didn't think that the WASP could be.
She argued that she was having a hard enough time getting women to fly, let alone getting a desegregated group of women to fly.
We were the first class that went to Sweetwater, and there the cadets were still there. And so as they phased them out, we were phased in. And I think it was a real surprise to the instructors and to everybody on the base that here a group of women came in. The first 3 classes took their training in Houston, Texas. We were the first class there. So it was kind of fun to have the cadets there.
The government had a program called Civilian Pilot Training Program, CPTP, and there were 20 people in the class. 5% of the class could be female.
I did not get my private pilot's license from the CPT program. I couldn't land the darn thing in the allotted space. I overshot Indianapolis Airport 3 times before I got it down, and you know, that just won't do.
The first class was 300 to 500 hours, and then they would lower it to 200 hours.
By the time I had heard about Jackie Cochran's program, you didn't have to have a private pilot's license. You just needed 35 hours.
We had Quonset huts, the 6 people in my bay. Really, those were the only ones that I knew. The one girl who slept next to me turned out to be my best friend for life.
My sister was in the WASP, so I decided that that's what I should do too. You know, we were, in World War II, we were very patriotic. It was a whole lot different than it is today.
Then, having got my pilot's license, I heard that 2 women had been hired at the Logan Airport Air Traffic Control. So I went over and applied and was accepted. So I had a choice between air traffic control and the WASPs. And I chose the air traffic control. I got 3 times my salary there, and I paid off most of my college debts.
They were big and small, and from wealthy families and from not so wealthy, and from absolute poverty like Jackie came from.
They didn't know that we would have paid them to let us fly those airplanes.
We really wanted to master those mighty machines.
Every day was an adventure, and I loved every minute of it.
We had this old instructor now. His key thing that he liked to do was take you up for the first flight and fly upside down for about 10 or 15 minutes.
My mom is a WASP. She started flying actually in college at the University of Washington. She was one of the original 20 to start in this organization because she had more than 200 hours of flying time and more than a commercial and instrument ratings. She was the only female in the United States to get the Air Medal because she ferried 4 airplanes back and forth across the United States in 4 days. And they used her as an example of what these women were doing. And she got the medal from Hap Arnold. She was the commander of the base in Long Beach. She had quite a few women underneath her.
Jackie Cochran was at my graduation and actually pinned my wings on.
And then my mother had come down for graduation, which was nice in March. And luckily she was in the front row and heard this conversation between Jackie and General Arnold. What he would do to pin on her wings, he'd have to reach in here, you know, punch those little things through the material and then fasten that little clip. He'd done about 6, and Mother heard Jackie say, "You don't have to do all those, General." And he turned to her and said, "Never mind, Jackie, I'm enjoying it." So he continued right to the end. There were 48 in our class, and he pinned on 48 wings.
Those early WASP classes, 43-1, 43-2, they all went into the ferrying division and worked as ferry pilots.
People say, well, the ladies didn't go overseas, they weren't exposed to anything. We were definitely exposed to live ammunition being shot at us every day. We'd go to the flight line every morning at 6 o'clock, Aloe Field, where they were towing targets. We'd go out over Matagorda Island. They were shooting live ammunition at us, and it was very exciting, but it was also, I felt like I was at the front. One time when I was getting ready to turn around and go back and drop my target, one of the male planes who had been doing aerial gunnery, he flew his plane up and locked wings, and so we could talk over the intercom without anybody hearing it, and invited me out for dinner that night.
My mission was to pick up planes at the factory and take them to the point of debarkation.
I had to do utility flying, which means if they needed someone flown from here to there or they wanted something picked up, you would just do it. And I also did engineering testing. In other words, if a student flew and came down and said, you know, that instrument isn't working right, or it pulls to the left, someone would go up and check out to see whether or not it was the way the student was flying it or was it really the aircraft.
You know, those mechanics were 60-day wonders, and you never knew how sharp they were.
I had one that the mechanic absolutely rigged it backwards. So when you pushed the stick forward, the nose went up. When you thought you were turning to the right, you turned to the left. So the ailerons and the rudders, everything was rigged wrong. I had enough power, and I realized I wasn't taking off just right. So as soon as I got up, I called the tower and told them that this was wrong, you know. And they said, well, you've got to come right back in. I said, no, I'm not. I'm going up and practice a little bit, doing it the opposite way so that I won't make a mistake when I land.
They were zooming down the runway at 100 miles an hour, pulled back on the stick, and it flew. It was so wonderful to think I was the very first person that ever flew that airplane.
It was 2 years of constant flying.
I was really impressed at how different people can be, but if they want the same thing, boy, they can cooperate.
In Montgomery, Alabama, I was the first woman to fly a P-51 to the Tuskegee Airmen.
It really made it easier for the girls in the military today, since we were the first military women pilot, because they said we couldn't fly, women couldn't fly, and they said black people couldn't fly. And the Tuskegee Airmen were the best pilots around.
38 women were killed, some in training, some during active duty.
I did join. I was expected to go to Texas for the training.
Mabel Rawlinson was the first WASP that really shook everybody up.
My sister was killed in an airplane. And of course, the family was devastated. We all were.
She crashed and she died, and it scared a lot of people. A number of WASP quit. They resigned afterwards. There are lots of stories about what happened to her, and it's not clear.
We had accidents where people buzzed, the guys buzzed the gals and hit the airplane, and they bailed out, and I lost my roommate that way.
Because the WASPs were civilians and serving as civilians, they were not eligible for military death benefits or military funerals. At some of the bases, the women were not given the respect they should have. The bodies were sent home. Other WASPs passed the hat.
In some places, the girls, called parents and helped.
Some bases, when WASPs were killed, the commanding officer not only sent the body back to the family, but sent a WASP in full uniform to escort the body back. It all depended on the commanding officer.
I was in altogether 11 months, and then came the sad, sad day, and that was December 20th, 1944, when we were disbanded.
That's one thing we did talk about, besides flying, was whether we would become military. And many of the women who had entered with 200 and more hours did not want to become military, because we were all kind of free souls,
I had been accepted into the next class of WASP, and then they were disbanded before I was able to start.
The women were the primary pursuit ferry pilots, and they were still very much needed.
P-51s were just sitting there, and we were disbanded, and we offered for $1 a year to fly them, but they absolutely didn't want us to do that. So here are these airplanes sitting on the tarmac, and with nobody to fly them.
It was all over, and you had to go home, and you had to get home on your own.
I started writing to manufacturers, airlines, anyone that I could think of trying to get a flying job. And I never heard no said in so many different ways as the response to all of these letters that I had written.
I had it easy because, see, I started flying right away as soon as I got home. There was an airport near me that the man was buying up these planes that were excess planes. Most of the girls went to work in an office, and I could make a flight or two a week and go get planes and make a whole lot more money than they did in an office.
I think it was one of the saddest days of my life.
So I put my WASP stuff aside and went on with my life, and I've had a normal life since. What I feel so grateful is to the girls that's at NASA and the airline pilots. I look at them in awe that they're getting to fly this beautiful equipment compared to what I got to fly. But they're looking at me and thanking me for opening the door, said that they would never have had the opportunity had the WASP not done a good job.